Welcome to today's session, a full intro to Azure Devops projects in 60 minutes or less, which according to our schedule should be done in 45 minutes. Feel free to use the hashtag Scottish Summit 2021 during this session, preferably about things that interest you during this session. So, before we get started, we'd like to thank the sponsors for this event, including ScriptRunner, DQ Global, Proximo 3, WebSpire, Agilicis, and Hitachi Solutions. And of course, everybody else involved with this event, including yourselves.
So for the next 45 minutes, we'll be doing a full intro into the Azure DevOps projects, which allows you to do the full application management lifecycle. This is from creating a work item all the way to its release. And we will be discussing both the cloud and on-premise versions of Azure DevOps, as well as its features, including the source control, the boards, the pipelines, artifacts, and test plans. And we will be showing how these services look during the session as well. And at the end of this session, you will have a basic understanding of Azure DevOps and how it can be used for data platform deployments.
So, to give this session some context, one of us is from the SQL development team and the other from the SQL operations team. We're basing it on SQL Server due to experience. However, most of the topics covered in this session are generic and can apply to all kinds of teams. For example, the topics we cover when we discuss source control can be modified to suit your team's needs. Anyway, our manager has decided that both teams will merge into one DevOps team, so that we're all one big happy family. Therefore, we must present this introduction to the team.
In reality, getting yourself and your team up to speed on these services is a real gradual process. However, since this is only a 45-minute session, we've taken it upon ourselves to speed up this process with this introduction. In addition, our manager has decided that the development team lead will be the Scrum Master and the operations team lead will be the product owner.
Now, for those of you who don't know, a product owner is responsible for translating business needs into workable backlog items or Scrum sprints, which means that they must speak to stakeholders at various levels within the business. In addition, they are ultimately responsible for prioritizing those items, even though they may get input about those priorities from various stakeholders.
And the Scrum Master's role is to empower the team to do those backlog items by encouraging how they work and removing any impediments if they appear.
Anyway, Sander, before we go any further, let's introduce ourselves.
Yes, shall we? So I am Sander. I am from the Netherlands. I work for Waypoint Analytical, which is a company based in the United States who do large scale water, soil, and plant sampling. I'm a cloud and data center MVP, and I'm a major contributor to the DBA Tools project. You can find me on Twitter. I have a. You can also find me on GitHub, where you will also be able to get the demos you'll see today. And I have a blog, which I try to write as much as I can, but due to other projects, it's mostly is a lesser priority. And now Kevin is going to do his slightly more complicated bio.
Well, thanks for that, Sander. Anyway, on that note, my name is Kevin Chant. I'm a senior database architect living in the Netherlands. However, as some of you may have picked up from the accent, I'm originally from the southwest of the UK. However, I live in the Netherlands due to the fact my wife is Dutch. So basically, I'm an Englishman living in the Netherlands, working for a French-based company because he met a woman in Australia. Now, whenever I say this out loud, I realize why certain people think this is complicated. I have over 24 years experience working in IT. And over that time, I've worked in various sectors, including the banking, audit, and the health insurance industries. In fact, I've supported companies that are in the top 10 of the Fortune 500 list. Now, I've worked with all versions of SQL Server in one form or another, as well as a large range of other applications and services as well. And I have various certifications, including both the old and the new style MCSE. And more recently, I became a Microsoft Certified DevOps Engineer Expert, which is fairly relevant for today's session. I'm also a Microsoft Certified Trainer and a Microsoft Data Platform MVP. And just like Sander, you can find me in a few places on social media as well. So, before we talk about projects, we want to discuss the differences between Azure DevOps Cloud Services and Azure DevOps Server. For those who aren't aware of the difference, Azure DevOps Server is the new name for TFS, which is the application that you install on premises to do your application lifecycle management. It's now been rebranded to look and feel just like the cloud-based Azure DevOps Cloud Services. Personally, Sander, I would like to use Azure DevOps Server so that we can handle its security better on premises. Plus, it means we keep the backend databases for Azure DevOps on premises as well, which means we can get to do some reporting capabilities that just aren't available in the Azure DevOps Cloud Service. However, the downside is that we'd have to build one or more servers with Azure DevOps and all the additional services required installed for business continuity reasons. Plus, we may have to wait a while for new features because of the cloud-first strategy. In addition to all of that, we'd have to patch and maintain all those servers we deployed as well.
Yeah. However, we've decided to use Azure DevOps Cloud Services instead. So we don't have to maintain and patch anything because it's all done behind the scenes by Microsoft for you. Plus, it's easier to install extensions from the marketplace.
Well, that's true, and we can still secure it in Azure anyway. Besides, whichever we use, we still have to consider security and compliance to keep our auditors happy. Luckily, Azure DevOps is well structured and easy to manage.
So the main point we want you to take away from this section is that if you install Azure DevOps Server, you have to patch and maintain everything yourself. As with the cloud-based version, everything is done behind the scenes for you.
So, with this in mind, I'm now going to demonstrate how the Azure DevOps homepage looks. So, let's go back to the homepage here. And if you look at Azure DevOps, you'll see it has its own hierarchy. At the top, you have your account, which has access to one or more organizations, which you can see on the left-hand side here. Now, these organizations can be the company you work for, or if you work for a large enterprise, it could just be a division within them. Or alternatively, it can be an organization you've created yourself for testing purposes, like you can see here. Now, if you have the right permissions, you can change various settings at the organization level. For example, you can change the name of your organization here. But if you do this and you show your organization, just be aware that all the URLs relating to that organization will change. So you'll probably want to tell anybody else who's using it. You can view and manage all your projects here that you use within your organization. You can view all the users here as well. And a few other interesting general settings, including viewing your extensions and Azure Active Directory integration, which you need if you want to take advantage of some of the newer Azure services like Azure Synapse Analytics. Now, you can also set security policies and permissions at the organization level. So this will apply to everything within your organization. You can set various Azure pipeline settings here. And again, these will all apply to the organization level as well. You can set a couple of interesting repository settings here. One of the ones I want to point out is the default branch name for new repositories. As some of you are probably aware, there is a little bit of controversy regarding the origins of the master branch naming convention in Git. So with this in mind, Microsoft now gives you the option to change the default branch name. And in fact, GitHub have now taken a similar stance. If you create a new repository in GitHub, your default branch name is called main from now on. Plus, if you install the Git clients, the latest versions like Git for Windows, you'll get the option to change it in there as well. And finally, and I've left the best to last of all the organization settings, is the processes that you can change for boards. We will cover what these processes mean later on, but I wanted to leave this to last so this one stays inside everybody's memories, because this will affect directly the way you work if you're using work items in Azure boards. So if we now go back up to your organization, you can see that each organization can contain one or more projects. And these projects, again, they could be a team you're working in, or it could be a project you're working on. It's all about context at the end of the day. However, if you work in a large organization, the majority of the time you will find these projects are actually split for the various different teams. So if I click on one of these projects here, and I happen to have one with a nice logo inside it for today, you will see all the services that Sander was talking about earlier on the left-hand side, including boards, repos, pipelines, plans, and artifacts. And again, just like at the organization level, if you have the right permissions, you can change settings at the project level as well. So you get to change some general settings again. You get to manage your teams within your project as well. For example, if I click on here, I can have remove users. I can fine-tune permissions for the teams themselves or individual users or logical groups that you decide to create in Azure Devops, which is handy if you want to do things like separation of duties for release approvals. You do have a few other interesting things here. For example, you can create service hooks in the third-party services like Jenkins and Microsoft Teams. And then you have your board settings here. So for example, you can set up all the iterations and areas or your team configurations. Quick tip, if you want to change your team quickly, just click on the down arrow at the top. If we scroll down a bit further, GitHub connections, which introduces some interesting capabilities. Then we got, again, pipeline settings, and these are at the project level this time around, including things like agent pools, which we'll cover shortly, and service connections, which can be quite useful. You can manage the repositories that you have within your project here, which is very useful, as well as a few other things. You can set the default branch name, so if you can't change it at the organization level, you can change it at the branch level, etc. You can view how much storage or your artifacts are using, which can be quite useful if you're using them in your company. And finally, there are some test settings that you can change as well.
Now we're talking. Remember that you can even go deeper with these settings if you dive into each of these features a little more specifically. So the main point we want you to take away from this section is how Azure DevOps is structured. So anyway, now we've covered the main project settings. Let's cover version control options with Azure Repos, which is a feature in Azure DevOps.
You mean like source safe?
Well, maybe something a little bit more modern. I actually worked with this product a long time ago. I was glad that I didn't have to do it anymore. So, but since Azure Repos supports multiple version control systems, we can probably use something like Git.
Well, that'd be only for your development work though, right? Because it sounds like version control would be complicated for the ops folks here today to learn.
Well, actually, I think if your ops team starts using version control for their day-to-day work, like all the saving all the scripts, they will probably start to perform better. And that's exactly what we did at the company I work for at the moment. That we started to put all our scripting and all our processes and documentation in version control, and that is used all the way throughout the IT department.
Well, I'm always game for performing better, Sander, so tell me more.
Yeah, so like I said, Azure Repos supports multiple version control systems because we want to use something like a distributed version control system. Git will be the choice for us. In fact, if you go into the Azure Repos right now, Kevin, you can show how it looks based on the SQL Server projects.
Okay, well, I'll fire over and have a look now. So basically, everybody, this is just a graphical representation of how your Git repository looks when it's stored away in Azure Repos. And as you can see, it's got similar GUI functionality as if you're using Git from the command line, so it's easy to translate over. From here, you can choose which branch you want to view as well. We'll cover branching in a bit. So like I said, you can also do things that you would do from the Git command here. So you can view your commits, you can view your pushes, you can view all your branches here, and we'll go back to those shortly as well. You can cover tags here to represent anything significant. And as you can see right now, Scottish Summit is significant. And you can view all the pull requests as well. And just a reminder that these repositories can contain all kinds of code. Obviously, this certain repository has a name relating to one service, but this can be absolutely anything, including Kubernetes, etc., etc. Anyway, Sander, what about branching strategies? Because I hear they're pretty important.
Yeah, they are. Without them, you probably just have one main branch, so that is not going to work very well. And there are various branching strategies out there that we can use. Two of them, like the Git flow and the GitHub flow.
Well, what's the main difference between those two? Because they sound pretty similar to me.
Yeah, they are pretty similar, but the major difference is that with the Git flow, you don't directly merge into the main branch. There's always something like a development branch. You only merge into the main branch if it's a hotfix. And with the GitHub workflow, there's not a development branch, and there are only feature branches. And each feature gets merged into the main branch right away after it's successfully tested. And us devs have been using source control for many years. So if we do something like pair programming, the op members can actually get used to it.
Peer programming.
No, pair programming, where two people work on the same code together. And this would normally be where you sit next to each other. And I know with the COVID-19 situation that's probably not going to work very well. But um, research has shown that it takes a bit longer to do. However, it means you end up with more stable code and people learn new coding practices faster and more efficient.
Wouldn't that mean there's a lot of overhead involved with that practice?
Well, like I said, there is it takes a little more time to do. Research has shown it's about 15% more overhead. But that overhead is largely compensated with the increased quality of code, which means less bug fixes. And we all know that bug fixes, which come up later in the development stage, if you go to production, costs a lot of money. So it will be more beneficial to get those bugs earlier on. Of course, we can do other things like code reviews as well. And at the end of the day, it's we just have to figure out what works best in our situation.
Okay, so what's to stop somebody coding their own release and pushing it straight to the main branch?
I'm glad you asked. So Azure DevOps has something called branching policies that we can use. One of which is that two people have to approve updates to the main branch using the pull requests.
Well, that sounds good. I think we need to do that to be SOX compliant anyway, since we deal with financial data. And in fact, if I remember correctly, we can go back and I can show you now, which is why I said we'd go back to branches earlier. So if you go to view your branches here in Azure Repos and click on the ellipses at the end, you can actually select branch policies here. Now, to be SOX compliant, you need the 4i principle in place. So to be able to do that, you would set your minimum number of reviewers to 2. And then in addition to that, to make sure that your repository, that your main branch performs a pull request every time, you would set automatically include reviewers. So for example, I would click on the plus sign and add either myself or Sander. And once I clicked on save on there, that would mean every time somebody wanted to use the main branch, they would actually have to raise a pull request.
And these are the main points we want you to take away from Azure Repos. Azure DevOps supports multiple version control systems. However, Git has become the facto standard nowadays. In addition, you can secure your updates using branching policies. You've seen Kevin just demonstrate right here. And Git really hooks in nicely with other tools from Microsoft like Visual Studio and Azure Data Studio as well.
Yep, and just to very quickly show how they both would actually look, I will go and select the right applications for you now. So, just to show you, this is how the repository you just saw just now with those two particular projects in. This is how it looks in Visual Studio. It's very easy to clone an existing repository when you open up Visual Studio as well, especially Visual Studio 2019. As you get the splash screen, that asks you to clone the repository right from the start. So you can just click on the clone, put in the URL, and it will go and do the clone for you if you haven't done it. Now, for those who don't know, Azure Data Studio is a new offering from Microsoft to be able to manage certain database services, including, of course, SQL Server related services and PostgreSQL as well. So here again is how those two projects would look if you were to use this particular application. And this application is very useful if you want to do quick wizards to deploy things, for example, using the new Azure Arc data services. So, moving on from there, Sander, we better discuss Azure Board since I'm going to be using it to organize our backlog items. Now, Azure Boards can use basic Agile, Scrum, or CMMI-based templates for each project you create in Azure DevOps. As I mentioned earlier when I went through the organization settings, these templates are actually called a process. Because we're using Scrum Sander, we'll probably want to use Scrum-related process. But now we can keep it standard, but we can customize these processes if we need to. For example, we can add new columns to product backlog items, like stakeholder, for example. So I'm just going to go back now into Azure DevOps and go into boards. And I'm just going to quickly run through the default features that you tend to get in Azure Boards. So you have work items, which allows you to view all your work items in a linear format. One really good way that you can use work items, no matter which process you're using, is you can look to view find removed items easily if you need to. From there, we have boards, and as some of you may recognize this, it allows you to work in a Kanban or Scrumban kind of way. And just like various other board-related services you may have used in the past, you can do customizations on there as well. Moving on from there, there's backlogs, which will allow you to view all your outstanding work items in a linear format. And then we have the sprint board, which is very useful, especially if you are working in something like Scrum, for example, where you can view the task board and see your process on a daily basis. And then finally, there's queries, which we're going to cover a bit more details about shortly as well.
Cool. So, can you tell me, how are the backlog items organized for Scrum?
Well, if I click on the hierarchy at the top here, you can see if you're using the Scrum process, it's based on epics, features, and backlog items. So basically, each board can have one or more epics, which can contain one or more features, which can then contain one or more product backlog items. Now, if we're using the Agile process, it would actually be user stories instead of product backlog items that you can see here.
Okay. So how do you we use the boards? I mean, if you have just if you have all the backlog items in one big list, it's going to be pretty cluttered, right?
Yeah, and that's why I propose we start giving backlog items sensible tags that we can filter on in case they get to be quite a lot.
Okay. So how will we know when an item is ready to go into a sprint?
Well, we could tag, if I open one of these up, for example, we could tag an item as being refined once it's met all the criteria. Another option is that we can just simply select the state to be approved. It's all entirely on how the team wants to work. By the way, everybody, the standard criteria for an item to be classed as refined in Scrum is that the item is clear and small enough to be ready for a sprint. However, businesses can have their own criteria for when an item is refined and ready for sprint as well.
That sounds pretty good, but hang on a minute though. But I've seen that we have various filters on the backlog board, but you can't show items that don't have a certain tag. How will we know when items are left to be refined?
I see what you mean. Because if I click on tags, I can filter for ones that have got an or, and there's an and option as well we can select. So if it's got multiple tags, but there's not a not option for the tag filter. Well, in that case, a nice easy solution is to create a beautiful query. Of course, they're not called a beautiful query. It's just a nickname that was given for them. And as you can see here, Sander, here's one I actually created earlier, which allows me to view all the backlog items that do not have the refine tag. And in fact, because we have an extension installed called a Wickle editor, I can actually view the code that's used for these queries and change them in here instead of using the GUI. And just to quickly show as well how it looks if you use the GUI instead, here's a graphical query designer, which will probably look very familiar to a lot of people that have used Microsoft-based query designers over the years. By the way, going back to your comment about this just now, I actually know an English guy living abroad. He put a request in to have it not added here. However, due to lack of demand, it wasn't followed through, which I can fully understand.
I wonder who that could be. Anyway, this is the part where we must set some realistic expectations.
You're right. For a start, if members of the team are new to Azure Devops, we're going to have to make sure that they get up to speed with it to make sure the team gets as much out of Azure Devops as possible, which is why I recommend we help them learn more about it, so encourage them however much we can. Of course, this applies even more if we look to merge the development and operational teams back together, because a lot of the time the teams will use different frameworks to do this. For example, one team would have used Kanban and the other team may have used Scrum. Or in fact, in a lot of cases, the operations team may have even only ever used a help desk solution instead. So a realistic expectation for a lot of people here is that's going to take some effort to do, because you're going to have to get one team used to another team's way of working so that you'll be able to merge their way of working together easier.
On that note, I'm guessing we're still going to use our other application to manage the boards in the meantime until we get through this and before we get a good look at the new Azure boards.
Well, it depends. If the company's okay with us using the other application, then it's fine. Of course, if they've decided to go all in with Azure DevOps instead, we can use the Azure application for a while to manage our boards whilst everybody gets used to Azure DevOps. However, personally, if this is the route your organization is going to take, I recommend ripping the band-aid off and doing the migration as soon as possible to take advantage of all the integration features within Azure DevOps. By the way, Sander, did I mention all the analytics and preview features we can potentially use with Azure Boards?
Calm down. We only have 45 minutes, Kevin. So, no.
Good point. Anyway, the main thing I want you to take away from this section is that Azure Boards is a very powerful way of managing Scrum or Agile work visually, especially if you're a product owner.
Okay, time to talk about Azure Pipelines, which is where we are going to look to build and deploy our deliverables. Like we said earlier, because this is based on a SQL team, we will cover how it applies to SQL Server. However, a lot of things here apply to the whole host of services, including the Kubernetes.
Okay, Sander, so how would this work with SQL Server?
Well, we could look to deploy either using state-based or migration-based deployments.
What's the main difference between those two?
Well, with state-based deployments, you have your solution, your Visual Studio solution, and the state of the project in there is going to be this deployed to your target. With migration-based, you start at a certain point and you create incremental scripts that are applied to the target. So on one point you have just a destination, and the other with migration based, you have the route to the destination. And migration based can be good, but if there is a problem, we probably have to redeploy all over again. For what we intend to do, I think state based is better for us. There are a lot of articles on the internet, by the way, state-based versus migration-based, and both have their pros and cons. So before you decide which one to use, make sure you
Yeah.
are fully aware.
And in fact, the repo we were showing earlier is actually based on the state-based migration as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so what about unit tests, Sander? Because I know we can do that for other programming languages within Azure DevOps.
Well, we can use something like T-SQL-T that to make our unit tests. And I like T-SQL-T because it keeps the database developer in its T-SQL bubble. They don't need to learn another language like C# or maybe PowerShell or anything like that. They can just write T-SQL code. So
That sounds good. Didn't you create an automated way of creating these unit tests for SQL Server?
Yes, I have. You want me to show you?
Very quickly, we've got just over 10 minutes.
Yeah, I can.
And we got everything, so.
I'm going to share my screen. Yes. I'm just seeing it right now.
No. I can vouch for that. Maybe for the benefit of this, we would just say it's more GitHub.
Yeah, it's one of the demos that you can create the unit tests. I created a PowerShell module called the PST-SQL-T test generator, which will take the current state of your database and create all kinds of basic unit tests for you, like the existence of objects, going through all the parameters for store procedures, all the columns for tables, the database collation, which is a really important one. So take a look at that, and if you have any questions, you know where to find me. So just for the benefit of time,
Yeah.
we're gonna.
On that note, I was looking in the results of your T-SQL-T generator earlier, and I noticed that we can either use the classic editor or YAML for our pipelines. Of course, the classic editor is the GUI-based version, and YAML is the code-based CI/CD version. So, which should we use?
Well, the GUI is good for exploring things, but I think where the development is going, and because of the entire infrastructure as code, I think YAML is going to be the better option to do. Just rip the band-aid off, get to know how YAML works, and then start doing it that way, because there are more options, and in the end, it's easier to use. And even with Azure Pipelines, you can add an extension by just clicking on it, and it will convert it to YAML into your pipeline anyway. So you don't have to write everything by yourself.
Well, that's true. And I remember actually you showing me that earlier. And in fact, whilst you were explaining about your T-SQL-T just test generator, I multitasked a bit and expanded it just ever so slightly. So basically, for those who aren't aware, this is the building unit testing stages, which are based on Sander's T-SQL-T unit test generator, etc. So what I actually did, Sander, as you can see, then your build unit testing stages here. I then deployed it to 3 containers, Docker containers representing integration, staging, and production environments. And these are standard environments you would use in any deployment pipeline that you want to use for whichever service, whether that's for Kubernetes, MySQL databases, etc., etc. So integration environments where you tend to do your integration tests, your staging environments where you tend to do your user acceptance tests, and then of course you would finally release to production. And of course you may have noticed that we are saying tests quite a few times in this session. And that's because the whole idea of deployment pipelines is that you do testing inside these pipelines as well to give everybody confidence that it's working. Anyway, back to this. And as you can see, Sander, I also, as part of this, I extended your thing to synchronize to GitHub repository as well, which is something you can do. And then from there, it would fire off a GitHub action, which is something new for GitHub. I also as well figured out a way to convert the project files behind the scenes, which would then get them to be deployed to various different database types like Azure SQL Database and Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pools. Of course, you can also deploy it to Azure managed instances as well. And in fact, you can use it to deploy the managed instances that's running in Azure Arc, just to be a bit more impressive there. So that's just to give everybody an idea of the kind of flexibility you can do with these YAML pipelines. And for those of you who have yet to see how YAML looks, here is some YAML code just solely for the benefit of you all here. And these, of course, are all the different tasks you can create to do things in the pipeline. Anyway, back over to you, Sander.
Yeah, in fact, I created a template that we are actually using right now to create your state-based solution. And that same template contains a pipeline for both Azure Devops and GitHub Actions. So you can either choose which one to use. And this is all down in the demos. So it's probably the first script, like to create project one. That will create, and you will see in the build folder all the different workflows and YAML files there. Of course, for SQL deployments, you can use PowerShell instead for your YAML to handle your deployments if we're dealing with a large number of servers.
So how do we know that worked?
Well, we could simply get PowerShell to output the XML in the same format as the JUnit test results, and then allow Azure DevOps to use the XML in a task to deploy them visually. Of course, we can put other feedback mechanisms in place for the deployments as well.
We can do that?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. So if we go to edit a pipeline, of course, are we limited to those tasks you saw on the screen earlier?
I kind of mentioned it before. We can go into the tasks and search the marketplace for any new tasks to install for additional ones. Of course, because we are an enterprise company, we probably have to request to install them instead of being able to do that straight away, which you usually do with the team, whichever managed Azure DevOps for the whole enterprise. And we've seen this, that some extensions are not thoroughly tested enough. So you probably want to do this with a good process and one person responsible.
Yeah. So anyway, I think we've covered a fair bit about this particular part of the pipeline. So let's just quickly cover agents. So basically, Microsoft hosts machines, essentially their own servers in Azure for you to do all the processing of the build and release tasks, like building various artifacts and deploying them. However, if you go to use the agents that are provided by Microsoft internally, you can have a lot of issues because you'll have to do a lot of things, for example, raise firewall requests for them to access your servers, etc. So We're probably better off building our own agents internally, Sander.
Maybe, but remember, a lot of us are developers and we don't want to build our own servers. Plus, we'd have to figure out how to exactly install the software we need and maintain them, right?
No, actually, as you can see here, Microsoft actually does provide a guide on how you can create the images for these agents. Even though the name may seem confusing for some of you, that's because it can actually you can use the same images for GitHub Actions as well. Anyway, I did run this through the command line earlier, Sander. Do you want to see how it looks, the full detailed results, if you run an agent as a command line instead?
Yeah, let's look at that.
So there you go. It's only verbose if you go very into detail.
Not a lot of information. Well, we better discuss test plans, which we can do when an initial build has been completed and before we release our artifacts somewhere else.
Yeah, for the benefit of time, I will just quickly explain that test plans is used when you want to manage the manual tests that you actually do within Azure DevOps. And in fact, I think I can very quickly show you this now. We have 3 minutes to spare. So basically, you create what's known as a test plan within Azure DevOps. Each test plan can have one or more test suites within them, and each test suite can contain one or more test cases. Just to make things a bit confusing, the test plans can actually just contain the test cases themselves. So it's kind of semi-structured. So what you can do, you can actually run it as a web application here and go through all the different tests you want to do. Your test cases can have nice pretty pictures in them, and you can create bugs based on them as well. So that was just a very quick introduction to test plans. I do recommend looking into it a lot more, though, for manual testing to bring confidence in your stakeholders.
Cool. We better discuss artifacts here, which is where we can share various things like NuGet packages with other parts of our organization. For example, if I create a NuGet package, I can share it with Azure Artifacts for others to use.
Yeah, and for those of you who've worked with Linux over the years, you can think of a feed that you would create in Azure Artifacts a lot like a repository. And there's various ones that Azure Artifacts supports. So, for example, NuGet packages like Sandra said, Python, etc. Also, one called Universal Packages as well, which pretty much means you can put anything inside it up to a certain size, which if I remember correctly, I think maybe 4 TB, but you want to check on that. And of course, just a reminder as well before we wrap up today that you can create your own Azure DevOps organization for testing, as we highlighted earlier.
Cool.
Anyway, Sander, to be honest, there's other features I'm looking forward to the team using as well. So we've got various things like dashboards that we can use in Azure DevOps.
Okay. Don't forget the wiki.
Well, that's true. And there's other things as well, like analytics views, for example, that we can use. So we can actually populate all of these views as they present them all as data sets and Power BI for use. There's also the Azure DevOps extension for CLI, right? So anybody who uses Azure CLI can actually add an extra extension to use Azure DevOps as well.
Okay, cool. That looks like a great way to manage projects. Like we said earlier, this will take a bit of work. So where shall we begin?
Well, I suggest we start by getting both teams together and explain to them what we're trying to achieve.
Food idea. We should get everybody on board if we want to get them to use Azure DevOps fully. Anyway, that's all we've got time for today, folks. And I wonder if there are any questions.
Dead on 45 minutes as well. So is there any questions?
Perfectly. have any questions.